The Confederate railways were deficient in rolling stock, and he determined to effect a large transfer from the Baltimore and Ohio. From Point of Rocks, 12 miles east of Harper's Ferry, to Martinsburg, 15 miles west, the line was double. The coal traffic along it, says General Imboden, was immense, for the Washington government was accumulating supplies of coal on the seaboard. These coal trains passed Harper's Ferry at all hours of the day and night, and thus furnished Jackson with a pretext for arranging a brilliant capture. A detachment was posted at Point of Rocks and the 5th Virginia Infantry at Martinsburg. He then complained to the president of the Baltimore and Ohio that the night trains, eastward bound, disturbed the repose of his camp, and requested a change of schedule that would pass all eastbound trains by Harper's Ferry between 11 and 1 o'clock in the daytime. The request was complied with, and thereafter for several days was heard the constant roar of passing trains for an hour before and an hour after noon. But since the empties were sent up the road at night, Jackson again complained that the nuisance was as great as ever, and as the road had 2 tracks, said he must insist that the westbound trains should pass during the same hour as those going east. Again he was obliged, and we then had, for 2 hours every day, the liveliest railroad in America. One night, as soon as the schedule was working at its best, Jackson instructed the officer commanding at Point of Rocks to take a force of men across to the Maryland side of the river the next day at 11 o'clock, and letting all westbound trains pass till 12 o'clock, to permit none to go east. He ordered the reverse to be done at Martinsburg. Thus he caught all the trains that were going east or west between these points, and ran them up to Winchester, 32 miles on the branch line, whence they were removed by horsepower to the railway at Strasburg, 18 miles further south. May 24th. This capture was Jackson's only exploit whilst in command at Harper's Ferry. On May 24th he was relieved by General Joseph E. Johnston, one of the senior officers of the Confederate Army. The transfer of authority was not, however, at once effected. Johnston reached Harper's Ferry in advance of his letter of appointment. Jackson had not been instructed that he was to hand over his command, and, strictly conforming to the regulations, he respectfully declined to vacate his post. Fortunately, a communication soon came from General Lee, commanding the Virginia troops, in which he referred to Johnston as in command at Harper's Ferry. Jackson at once recognized this letter as official evidence that he was superseded, and from that time forth rendered his superior the most faithful and zealous support. He seems at first to have expected that he would be sent to northwest Virginia, and his one ambition at this time was to be selected as the instrument of saving his native mountains to the south. But the Confederate government had other views. At the beginning of June, a more compact organization was given to the regiments at Harper's Ferry, and Jackson was assigned to the command of the 1st Brigade of the Army of the Shenandoah. Recruited in the valley of the Shenandoah and the Western Mountains, the brigade consisted of the following regiments: the 2nd Virginia, Colonel Allen; the 4th Virginia, Colonel Preston; the 5th Virginia, Colonel Harper; the 27th Virginia, Lieutenant Colonel Eccles; the 33rd Virginia, Colonel Cummings. A battery of artillery, raised in Rockbridge County, was attached to the brigade. Commanded by the Reverend Dr. Pendleton, the rector of Lexington, an old West Point graduate, who was afterwards distinguished as Lee's chief of artillery, and recruited largely from theological colleges, it soon became peculiarly efficient. No better material for soldiers ever existed than the men of the valley. Most of them were of Scotch-Irish descent, but from the more northern counties came many of English blood, and from those in the centre of Swiss and German. But whatever their origin, they were thoroughly well qualified for their new trade. All classes mingled in the ranks and all ages, the heirs of the oldest families and the humblest of the sons of toil. Boys whom it was impossible to keep at school, and men whose white beards hung below their crossbelts, youths who had been reared in luxury, and rough hunters from their lonely cabins. They were a mountain people, nurtured in a wholesome climate, bred to manly sports and hardened by the free life of the field and forest. To social distinctions they gave little heed. They were united for a common purpose. They had taken arms to defend Virginia and to maintain her rights, and their patriotism was proved by the sacrifice of all personal consideration and individual interest. Nor is the purity of their motives to be questioned. They had implicit faith in the righteousness of their cause. Slave owners were few in the valley, and the farms were tilled mainly by free labour. The abolition of Negro servitude would have affected but little the population west of the Blue Ridge. But nevertheless, west of the Blue Ridge, the doctrine of state rights was as firmly rooted as in the Carolinas, the idea that a state could be coerced into remaining within the Union as fiercely repudiated, and the men of the valley faced the gathering hosts of the North in the same spirit that they would have faced the hosts of a foreign foe. In the first weeks of June, the military situation became more threatening. The Union armies were taking shape. The levies of volunteers seemed sufficiently trained to render reconquest practicable, and the great wave of invasion had already mounted the horizon. A force of 25,000 men, based on the Ohio, threatened northwest Virginia. There had been collisions on the Atlantic seaboard, where the Federals held Fortress Monroe, a strong citadel within 80 miles of Richmond, and Richmond had become the capital of the Confederacy. There had been fighting in Missouri, and the partisans of the South in that state had already been badly worsted. The vast power of the North was making itself felt on land, and on the sea had asserted an ascendancy which it never lost. The blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico were patrolled by a fleet with which the Confederates had no means of coping. From the seawall of Charleston, the great Atlantic port of the South, the masts of the blockading squadron were visible in the offing, and beyond the mouths of the Mississippi, closing the approaches to New Orleans, the long black hulls steamed slowly to and fro. But it was about Manassas Junction, 30 miles southwest of Washington and barring the road to Richmond, that all interest centered during the first campaign. Here was posted the main army of the Confederacy, 20,000 volunteers under General Beauregard, the Manassas Gap Railway forming an easy means of communication with the Army of the Shenandoah. Johnston's force had been gradually increased to 10,000 officers and men, but the general was by no means convinced of the desirability of holding Harper's Ferry. The place itself was insignificant. It had contained an arsenal, but this had been burnt by the Federals when they evacuated the post, and it was absolutely untenable against attack. To the east runs the Shenandoah, and immediately above the river stands a spur of the Blue Ridge, the Loudoun Heights, completely commanding the little town. Beyond the Potomac is a crest of equal altitude, covered with forest trees and undergrowth, and bearing the name of the Maryland Heights. Jackson, without waiting for instructions, had taken on himself to hold and fortify the Maryland Heights. "I am of opinion," he had written to General Lee, "that this place should be defended with the spirit which actuated the defenders of Thermopylae, and if left to myself, such is my determination. The fall of this place would, I fear, result in the loss of the northwestern part of the state, and who can estimate the moral power thus gained to the enemy and lost to ourselves?" Lee also was averse to evacuation. Such a measure, he said, would be depressing to the cause of the South, and would leave Maryland isolated. The post, it was true, could be easily turned. By crossing the Potomac at Williamsport and Shepherdstown, 20 and 10 miles northwest respectively, the Federals would threaten the communications of the garrison with Winchester. In case they were attacked, the Confederates would have to fight with their backs to the Shenandoah, broad, deep, and unbridged, and the ground westward of Harper's Ferry was ill-adapted for defence. Attack, in Lee's opinion, would have been best met by a resolute offensive. Johnston, however, believed his troops unfitted for active manoeuvres, and he was permitted to choose his own course. The incident is of small importance, but it serves to show an identity of opinion between Lee and Jackson, and a regard for the moral aspect of the situation which was to make itself manifest with extraordinary results at a later period. On June 14th, Johnston destroyed the railway bridge over the Potomac, removed the machinery that had been rescued from the arsenal, burned the public buildings, and the next day retired on Winchester. His immediate opponent, General Patterson, had crossed the Pennsylvania border and, moving through Maryland, had occupied Williamsport with 14,000 men. A detachment of Confederate militia had been driven from Romney, 35 miles northwest of Winchester, and the general forward movement of the enemy had become pronounced. On June 20th, Jackson's brigade was ordered to destroy the workshops of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway at Martinsburg, together with the whole of the rolling stock that might there be found, and to support the cavalry. The first of these tasks, although Martinsburg is no more than 10 miles distant from Williamsport, was easily accomplished. 4 locomotives were sent back to Winchester, drawn by teams of horses, and several more, together with many wagons, were given to the flames. The second task demanded no unusual exertions. The Federals, as yet, manifested no intention of marching upon Winchester, nor was the Confederate cavalry in need of immediate assistance. The force numbered 300 sabres. The men were untrained, but they were first-rate horsemen. They knew every inch of the country, and they were exceedingly well commanded. Lieutenant Colonel J.E.B. Stuart, who had been a captain of dragoons in the United States Army, had already given token of those remarkable qualities which were afterward to make him famous. Of an old Virginia family, he was the very type of the cavalier, fearless and untiring, boisterous as March, yet fresh as May. Educated at West Point and trained in Indian fighting in the prairies, he brought to the great struggle upon which he had now entered a thorough knowledge of arms, a bold and fertile conception, and a constitution of body which enabled him to bear up against fatigues which would have prostrated the strength of other men. Those who saw him at this time are eloquent in their description of the energy and the habits of the man. They tell how he remained almost constantly in the saddle, how he never failed to instruct personally every squad which went out on picket, how he was everywhere present at all hours of the day and night along the line which he guarded, and how, by infusing into the raw cavalry his own activity and watchfulness, he was enabled, in spite of the small force which he commanded, to observe the whole part of the Potomac from Point of Rocks to beyond Williamsport. His animal spirits were unconquerable, his gaiety and humour unfailing. He had a ready jest for all, and made the forests ring with his songs as he marched at the head of his column. So great was his activity that General Johnston compared him to that species of hornet called a yellow jacket, and said that he was no sooner brushed off than he lit back again. When the general was subsequently transferred to the West, he wrote to Stuart, "How can I eat, sleep, or rest in peace without you upon the outpost?" No officer in the Confederacy was more trusted by his superiors or more popular with the men, and Jackson was no more proof than others against the attractions of his sunny and noble nature. As a soldier, Stuart was a colleague after his own heart, and as a man he was hardly less congenial. The dashing horseman of 28, who rivalled Murat in his fondness for gay colours, and to all appearance looked upon war as a delightful frolic, held a rule of life as strict as that of his Presbyterian comrade, and outwardly a sharp contrast. Inwardly they were in the closest sympathy. Stuart's fame as a leader was to be won in larger fields than those west of the Blue Ridge, and, although sprung from the same Scotch-Irish stock, he was in no way connected with the Valley soldiers. But from the very outbreak of the war he was intimately associated with Jackson and his men. Fortune seemed to take a curious delight in bringing them together. They were together in their first skirmish and in their last great victory. And now, on the banks of the Potomac, watching the hostile masses that were assembling on the further shore, they first learned to know each other's worth. On July 2nd, Patterson crossed the river. The movement was at once reported by Stuart, and Jackson, with the 5th Virginia and a battery, advanced to meet the enemy. His instructions from Johnston were to ascertain the strength of the hostile force, and then to retire under cover of the cavalry. 4 regiments of his brigade were therefore left in camp. The baggage was sent back, and when the 5th Virginia had marched out a short distance, 3 of the 4 guns were halted. Near Falling Waters, a country church some 5 miles south of the Potomac, Patterson's advanced guard was discovered on the road. The country on either hand, like the greater part of the valley, was open, undulating, and highly cultivated, view and movement being obstructed only by rail fences and patches of high timber. The Virginians were partially concealed by a strip of woodland, and when the Federal skirmishers, deployed on either side of the highway, moved forward to the attack, they were received by a heavy and unexpected fire. As the enemy fell back, a portion of the Confederate line was thrown forward, occupying a house and barn, and despite the fire of 2 guns which the Federals had brought up, the men, with the impetuous rashness of young troops, dashed out to the attack. But Jackson intervened. The enemy, who had 2 brigades of infantry well closed up, was deploying a heavy force. His skirmishers were again advancing, and the 5th Virginia, in danger of being outflanked, was ordered to retire to its first position. The movement was misconstrued by the Federals, and down the high road in solid column came the pursuing cavalry. A well-aimed shot from the single field piece sufficed to check their progress. A confused mass of horsemen went flying to the rear, and the Confederate gunners turned their attention to the hostile battery. Stuart, at the same time, performed a notable feat. He had moved with 50 troopers to attack the enemy's right flank, and in reconnoitring through the woods had become detached for the moment from his command. As he rode along a winding lane, he saw resting in a field a company of Federal infantry. He still wore the uniform of the United States Army. The enemy suspected nothing, taking him for one of their own cavalry, and he determined to effect their capture. Riding up to the fence, he bade one of the men remove the bars. This was done with respectful alacrity, and he then galloped among them, shouting, "Throw down your arms, or you are all dead men." The stentorian order was at once obeyed. The raw troops not only dropped their rifles, but fell upon their faces, and the Confederate troopers, coming to their leader's aid, marched the whole company as prisoners to the rear. So firm was the attitude of Jackson's command that General Patterson was thoroughly imposed upon. Slowly and cautiously he pushed out right and left, and it was not till near noon that the Confederates were finally ordered to retreat. Beyond desultory skirmishing, there was no further fighting. The 5th Virginia fell back on the main body. Stuart came in with his string of captives, and leaving the cavalry to watch the enemy, the 1st Brigade went into camp some 2 miles south of Martinsburg. Patterson reported to his government that he had been opposed by 3,500 men, exactly 10 times Jackson's actual number. The losses on either side were inconsiderable, a few men killed and 10 or 15 wounded, and if the Confederates carried off 50 prisoners, the Federals had the satisfaction of burning some tents which Jackson had been unable to remove. The engagement, however, had the best effect on the morale of the Southern troops, and they were not so ignorant as to overlook the skill and coolness with which they had been manoeuvred. It is possible that their commander appeared in an unexpected light, and that they had watched his behaviour with some amount of curiosity. They certainly discovered that a distaste for show and frippery is no indication of an unwarlike spirit. In the midst of the action, while he was writing a dispatch, a cannonball had torn a tree above his head to splinters. Not a muscle moved, and he wrote on as if he were seated in his own tent. The day after Falling Waters, on Johnston's recommendation, Jackson received from General Lee his commission as Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. "My promotion," he wrote to his wife, "was beyond what I had anticipated, as I only expected it to be in the volunteer forces of the state. One of my greatest desires for advancement is the gratification it will give my darling, and the opportunity, of serving my country more efficiently. I have had all that I ought to desire in the line of promotion. I should be very ungrateful if I were not contented, and exceedingly thankful to our kind Heavenly Father." Of Patterson's further movements, it is unnecessary to speak at length. The Federal army crawled on to Martinsburg. Halting 7 miles southwest, Jackson was reinforced by Johnston's whole command, and here, for 4 days, the Confederates, drawn up in line of battle, awaited attack. But the Federals stood fast in Martinsburg, and on the fourth day Johnston withdrew to Winchester. The Virginia soldiers were bitterly dissatisfied. At first, even Jackson chafed. He was eager for further action. His experiences at Falling Waters had given him no exalted notion of the enemy's prowess, and he was ready to engage them single-handed. "I want my brigade," he said, "to feel that it can itself whip Patterson's whole army, and I believe we can do it." But Johnston's self-control was admirable. He was ready to receive attack, believing that, in his selected position, he could repulse superior numbers. But he was deaf to all who clamoured for an offensive movement, to the murmurs of the men and to the remonstrances of the officers. The stone houses of Martinsburg and its walled enclosures were proof against assault and promised at most a bloody victory. His stock of ammunition was scanty in the extreme. The infantry had but 14 cartridges apiece, and although his patience was construed by his troops as a want of enterprise, he had in truth displayed great daring in offering battle south of Martinsburg. The Federal army at Washington, commanded by General McDowell, amounted to 50,000 men. A portion of this force was already south of the Potomac, and Beauregard's 20,000 Confederates at Manassas Junction were seriously threatened. In West Virginia, the enemy had advanced, moving fortunately in the direction of Staunton at the southern end of the valley, and not on Winchester. On July 11th, this force of 20,000 men defeated a Confederate detachment at Rich Mountain, not far from Jackson's birthplace. And although it was still in the heart of the Alleghanies, a few marches, which there were practically no troops to oppose, would give it the control of the upper valley. Thus, menaced by 3 columns of invasion, numbering together over 80,000 men, the chances of the Confederates, who mustered no more than 32,000 all told, looked small indeed. But the 3 Federal columns were widely separated, and it was possible, by means of the Manassas Gap Railway, for Johnston and Beauregard to unite with greater rapidity than their opponents. President Davis, acting on the advice of General Lee, had therefore determined to concentrate the whole available force at Manassas Junction and to meet at that point the column advancing from Washington. The difficulty was for the Army of the Shenandoah to give Patterson the slip. This could easily have been done while that officer stood fast at Martinsburg, but in Lee's opinion, if the enemy found that the whole force of the Confederacy was concentrating at Manassas Junction, the Washington column would remain within its entrenchments round the capital, and the Confederates would be put to the great disadvantage of achieving nothing and leaving the other points, Winchester and Staunton, exposed. The concentration, therefore, was to be postponed until the Washington column advanced. But by that time Patterson might be close to Winchester or threatening the Manassas Railway. Johnston had thus a most delicate task before him, and in view of the superior numbers which the Federals could bring against Manassas, it was essential that not a man should he wasted in minor enterprises. The defeat of Patterson, even had it been practicable, would not have prevented the Washington column from advancing, and every Confederate rifleman who fell in the valley would be one the less at Manassas. On July 15th, Patterson left Martinsburg and moved in the direction of Winchester. On the 16th he remained halted at Bunker's Hill, 9 miles north, and on the 17th, instead of continuing his advance, moved to his left and occupied Charlestown. His indecision was manifest. He, too, had no easy part to play. His instructions were to hold Johnston in the valley, while McDowell advanced against Beauregard. But his instructions were either too definite or not definite enough, and he himself was overcautious. He believed, and so did General Scott, that Johnston might be retained at Winchester by demonstrations, that is, by making a show of strength and by feigned attacks. For more vigorous action, Patterson was not in the least inclined, and we can hardly wonder if he hesitated to trust his ill-trained regiments to the confusion and chances of an attack. Even in that day of raw soldiers and inexperienced leaders, his troops had an unenviable reputation. They had enlisted for 3 months, and their term of service was nearly up. Their commander had no influence with them, and turning a deaf ear to his appeals, they stubbornly refused to remain with the colours even for a few days over their term of service. They were possibly disgusted with the treatment they had received from the government. The men had received no pay. Many were without shoes, and others, according to their general, were without pants. They cannot march, he adds, and unless a paymaster goes with them, they will be indecently clad and have just cause of complaint. Nevertheless, the federal authorities made a grievous mistake when they allowed Patterson and his sans-culottes to move to Charlestown. McDowell marched against Beauregard on the afternoon of the 16th, and Patterson should have been instructed to attack Johnston at any cost. Even had the latter been successful, he could hardly have reinforced the main army in time to meet McDowell. At 1 a.m. on the morning of the 18th, Johnston received a telegram from the President to the effect that McDowell was advancing on Manassas. Stuart was immediately directed to keep Patterson amused, and leaving their sick, 700 in number, to the care of Winchester, the troops were ordered to strike tents and prepare to march. No man knew the object of the movement, and when the regiments passed through Winchester, marching southward, with their backs to the enemy, the step was lagging, and the men dispirited. A few miles out, as they turned eastward, the brigades were halted, and an order was read to them. Our gallant army under General Beauregard is now attacked by overwhelming numbers. The commanding general hopes that his troops will step out like men and make a forced march to save the country. The effect of this stirring appeal was instantaneous. The soldiers, says Jackson, rent the air with shouts of joy, and all was eagerness and animation. The march was resumed, and as mile after mile was passed, although there was much useless delay and the pace was slow, the faint outlines of the Blue Ridge, rising high above the valley, changed imperceptibly to a mighty wall of rock and forest. As the night came down, a long reach of the Shenandoah crossed the road. The ford was waist-deep, but the tall Virginians, plunging without hesitation into the strong current, gained the opposite shore with little loss of time. The guns and wagons followed in long succession through the darkling waters, and still the heavy tramp of the toiling column passed eastward through the quiet fields. The Blue Ridge was crossed at Ashby's Gap, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, near the little village of Paris, the 1st Brigade was halted on the further slope. They had marched over 20 miles, and so great was their exhaustion that the men sank prostrate on the ground beside their muskets. They were already sleeping when an officer reminded Jackson that there were no pickets round the bivouac. "Let the poor fellows sleep," was the reply. "I will guard the camp myself." And so, through the watches of the summer night, the general himself stood sentry over his unconscious troops. Chapter 6. The First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. At the first streak of dawn, Jackson aroused his men and resumed the march. Before the column gained the plain, Stuart's cavalry clattered past, leaving Patterson at Charlestown, in ignorance of his adversary's escape, and congratulating himself on the success of his cautious strategy. At Piedmont, a station at the foot of the Blue Ridge, trains were waiting for the conveyance of the troops, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jackson and his brigade had reached Manassas Junction. The cavalry, artillery, and wagons moved by road, and the remainder of Johnston's infantry was expected to follow the 1st Brigade without delay. But in war, unless there has been ample time for preparation, railways are not always an expeditious means of travel. The line was single, so short notice had been given that it was impossible to collect enough rolling stock. The officials were inexperienced. There was much mismanagement. And on the morning of Sunday, July 21st, only 3 brigades of the Army of the Shenandoah, Jackson's, Bee's, and Bartow's, together with the cavalry and artillery, had joined Beauregard. Kirby Smith's brigade, about 1,900 strong, was still upon the railway. The delay might easily have been disastrous. Happily, the Federal movements were even more tardy. Had the invading army been well organized, Beauregard would probably have been defeated before Johnston could have reached him. McDowell had advanced from Washington on the afternoon of the 16th with 35,000 men. On the morning of the 18th, the greater part of his force was concentrated at Centerville, 22 miles from Washington, and 5½ northeast of Manassas Junction. Beauregard's outposts had already fallen back to the banks of Bull Run, a stream made difficult by wooded and precipitous banks, from 2 to 3 miles south, and of much the same width as the Thames at Oxford. It would have been possible to have attacked on the morning of the 19th, but the Federal commander was confronted by many obstacles. He knew little of the country. Although it was almost within sight of the capital, the maps were indifferent. Guides who could describe roads and positions from a military point of view were not forthcoming. All information had to be procured by personal reconnaissance, and few of his officers had been trained to such work. Moreover, the army was most unwieldy. 35,000 men, together with 10 batteries and the requisite train of wagons, was a force far larger than any American officer had yet set eyes upon, and the movement of such a mass demanded precise arrangement on the part of the staff, and on the part of the troops most careful attention to order and punctuality. But of these, both staff and troops were incapable. The invading force might have done well in a defensive position, which it would have had time to occupy, and where the supply of food and forage carried on from stationary magazines would have been comparatively easy. But directly it was put in motion, inexperience and indiscipline stood like giants in the path. The Federal troops were utterly unfitted for offensive movement, and both Scott and McDowell had protested against an immediate advance. The regiments had only been organised in brigades a week previously. They had never been exercised in mass. Deployment for battle had not yet been practised, and to deploy 10,000 or 20,000 men for attack is a difficult operation, even with well-drilled troops and an experienced staff. Nor were the supply arrangements yet completed. The full complement of wagons had not arrived, and the drivers on the spot were as ignorant as they were insubordinate. The troops had received no instruction in musketry, and many of the regiments went into action without having once fired their rifles. But the protests of the generals were of no effect. The Federal cabinet decided that in face of the public impatience it was impossible to postpone the movement. "On to Richmond" was the universal cry. The halls of Congress resounded with the fervid eloquence of the politicians. The press teemed with bombastic articles in which the northern troops were favourably compared with the regular armies of Europe, and the need of discipline and training for the fearless and intelligent representatives of the sovereign people was scornfully repudiated. Ignorance of war and contempt for the lessons of history were to cost the nation dear. The march from Washington was a brilliant spectacle. The roads south of the Potomac were covered with masses of men, well armed and well clothed, amply furnished with artillery, and led by regular officers. To the sound of martial music they had defiled before the President. They were accompanied by scores of carriages. Senators, members of Congress, and even ladies swelled the long procession. A crowd of reporters rode beside the columns, and the return of a victorious army could hardly have been hailed with more enthusiasm than the departure of these untrained and unblooded volunteers. Yet, pitiful masquerade as the march must have appeared to a soldier's eye, the majority of those who broke camp that summer morning were brave men and good Americans. To restore the Union, to avenge the insult to their country's flag, they had come forward with no other compulsion than the love of their motherland. If their self-confidence was supreme and even arrogant, it was the self-confidence of a strong and a fearless people, and their patriotism was of the loftiest kind. It would have been easy for the North, with her enormous wealth, to have organised a vast army of mercenaries wherewith to crush the South. But no, her sons were not willing that their country's honour should be committed to meaner hands. As they advanced into Virginia, the men, animated by their surroundings, stepped briskly forward, and the countryside was gay with fantastic uniforms and gorgeous standards. But the heat was oppressive, and the roads lay deep in dust. Knapsack, rifle, and blankets became a grievous burden. The excitement died away, and unbroken to the monotonous exertion of the march, the 3 months' recruits lost all semblance of subordination. The compact array of the columns was gradually lost, and a tail of laggards, rapidly increasing, brought up the rear. Regiment mingled with regiment. By each roadside, brook the men fell out in numbers. Every blackberry bush was surrounded by a knot of stragglers, and heedless of the orders of those officers who still attempted to keep them in the ranks, scores of so-called soldiers sought the cool shade of the surrounding woods. When darkness fell, the army was but 6 miles from its morning bivouacs, and it was not till late the next day that the stragglers rejoined their regiments. McDowell had intended to attack at once. "But I could not," he says, "get the troops forward earlier than we did. I wished them to go to Centreville the second day, but when I went to urge them forward, I was told that it was impossible for the men to march further. They had only come from Vienna, about 6 miles, and it was not more than 6.5 miles further to Centreville, in all a march of 12.5 miles, but the men were foot-weary, not so much, I was told, by the distance marched, as by the time they had been on foot, caused by the obstructions in the road, and the slow pace we had to move to avoid ambuscades. The men were, moreover, unaccustomed to marching, and not used to carrying even the load of light marching order. The trains, hurriedly gotten together, with horses, wagons, drivers, and wagon masters, all new and unused to each other, moved with difficulty and disorder, and were the cause of a day's delay in getting the provisions forward. On the morning of the 18th, in order to attract the enemy's attention from his right, a brigade was sent south, in the direction of Bull Run. The Confederate outposts fell back over Blackburn's Ford. The woods about the stream concealed the defenders' forces, and the Federals pushed on, bringing artillery into action. 2 Confederate guns, after firing a few shots, were withdrawn under cover, and the attacking troops reached the ford. Suddenly, from the high timber on the further bank, volleys of musketry blazed out in their very faces, and then came proof that some at least of the Federal regiments were no more to be relied upon in action than on the march. A portion of the force, despite the strong position of the enemy and the heavy fire, showed a bold front, but at least one regiment turned and fled, and was only rallied far in rear. The whole affair was a mistake on the part of the commander. His troops had been heedlessly pushed forward, and General Longstreet, commanding the opposing brigade, by carefully concealing his infantry, had drawn him into an ambuscade. The results of the action were not without importance. The Federals fell back with a loss of 83 officers and men, and the Confederates were much elated at their easy success. Among some of the Northerners, on the other hand, the sudden check to the advance and the bold bearing of the enemy turned confidence and enthusiasm into irrational despondency. A regiment and a battery, which had enlisted for 3 months and whose time was up, demanded their discharge, and notwithstanding the appeals of the Secretary of War, moved to the rear to the sound of the enemy's cannon. McDowell's plans were affected by the behaviour of his troops. He was still ignorant, so skilfully had the march from the valley been carried out, that Johnston had escaped Patterson. He was well aware, however, that such movement was within the bounds of possibility, yet he found himself compelled to postpone attack until the 21st. The 19th and 20th were spent in reconnaissance and in bringing up supplies, and the lack of organisation made the issue of rations a long process. But it was the general's want of confidence in his soldiers that was the main cause of delay. The Confederates were strongly posted. The bridges and fords across Bull Run, with the exception of Sudley Ford, a long way upstream to the Federal right, were obstructed with felled trees and covered by rude entrenchments. Even with regular troops, a direct attack on a single point of passage would have been difficult. McDowell's first idea was to pass across the front of the defences and turn the right at Wolf Run Shoals, 5 miles southeast of Union Mills. The country, however, on this flank was found to be unfit for the operations of large masses, and it was consequently determined to turn the Confederate left by way of Sudley Springs. The Federal Army consisted of 5 divisions of infantry, 43 guns, and 7 troops of regular cavalry. 9 batteries and 8 companies of infantry were supplied by the United States Army, and there was a small battalion of Marines. The strength of the force told off for the attack amounted to 30,000 all told. The Confederates, along the banks of Bull Run, disposed of 26,000 infantry, 2,500 cavalry, and 55 guns. Johnston, who had arrived on the 20th, had assumed command, but, ignorant of the country, he had allowed Beauregard to make the dispositions for the expected battle. The line occupied was extensive, 6 miles in length, stretching from the Stone Bridge, where the Warrenton High Road crosses Bull Run on the left to the ford at Union Mills on the right. Besides these 2 points of passage, there were no less than 6 fords, to each of which ran a road from Centreville. The country to the north was undulating and densely wooded, and it would have been possible for the Federals, especially as the Southern cavalry was held back south of the stream, to mass before any one of the fords, unobserved, in superior numbers. Several of the fords, moreover, were weakly guarded, for Beauregard, who had made up his mind to attack, had massed the greater part of his army near the railroad. The Shenandoah troops were in reserve. Bee's and Bartow's brigades between McLean's and Blackburn's fords, Jackson's between Blackburn's and Mitchell's fords, in rear of the right centre. The position south of Bull Run, originally selected by General Lee, was better adapted for defence than for attack. The stream, with its high banks, ran like the ditch of a fortress along the front, and to the south was the plateau on which stands Manassas Junction. The plateau is intersected by several creeks, running through deep depressions, and dividing the high ground into a series of bold undulations, level on the top and with gentle slopes. The most important of the creeks is Young's Branch, surrounding on 2 sides the commanding eminence crowned by the Henry House, and joining Bull Run a short distance below the Stone Bridge. That part of the field which borders on Flat Run and lies immediately north of Manassas Junction is generally thickly wooded. But shortly after passing New Market, the Manassas-Sudley Road, running northwest, emerges into more open country, and, from the Henry House onward, passes over several parallel ridges, deep in grass and corn, and studded between with groves of oak and pine. Here the large fields, without hedges and scantily fenced, formed an admirable manoeuvre ground. The wide depressions of the creeks, separating the crests of the ridges by a space of 1,500 or 1,600 yards, gave free play to the artillery. The long, easy slopes could be swept by fire, and the groves were no obstruction to the view. The left flank of the Confederate position, facing north, on either side of the Manassas-Sudley Road, was thus an ideal battlefield. July 21st, 6:30 a.m. Sunday morning, the 21st of July, broke clear and warm. Through a miscarriage of orders, the Confederate offensive movement was delayed, and soon after 6 o'clock the Federals opened with musketry and artillery against the small brigade commanded by Colonel Evans, which held the Stone Bridge on the extreme left of the Confederate line. An hour later, the Shenandoah brigades, Bee's, Bartow's, and Jackson's, together with Bonham's, were ordered up in support. 8:30 a.m. The attack was feebly pressed, and at 8:30 Evans, observing a heavy cloud of dust rising above the woods to the north of the Warrenton Road, became satisfied that the movement to his front was but a feint, and that a column of the enemy was meanwhile marching to turn his flank by way of Sudley Springs, about 2 miles northwest. 9 a.m. Sending back this information to the next brigade, he left 4 companies to hold the bridge, and with 6 companies of riflemen, a battalion called the Louisiana Tigers, and 2 6-pounder howitzers, he moved across Young's Branch and took post on the Matthews Hill, a long ridge which, at the same elevation, faces the Henry Hill. Evans's soldierly instinct had penetrated the design of the Federal commander, and his ready assumption of responsibility threw a strong force across the path of the turning column, and gave time for his superiors to alter their dispositions and bring up the reserves. The Federal force opposite the Stone Bridge consisted of a whole division, and its commander, General Tyler, had been instructed to divert attention by means of a vigorous demonstration from the march of Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions to a ford near Sudley Springs. Part of the 5th Division was retained in reserve at Centreville, and part threatened the fords over Bull Run below the Stone Bridge. The 4th Division had been left upon the railroad, 7 miles in rear of Centreville, in order to guard the communications with Washington. Already, in forming the line of march, there had been much confusion. The divisions had bivouacked in loose order, without any regard for the morrow's movements, and their concentration previous to the advance was very tedious. The brigades crossed each other's route. The march was slow, and the turning column, blocked by Tyler's division on its way to the Stone Bridge, was delayed for nearly 3 hours. 9:30 a.m. At last, however, Hunter and Heintzelman crossed Sudley Ford, and after marching a mile in the direction of Manassas Junction, the leading brigade struck Evans' riflemen. The Confederates were concealed by a fringe of woods, and the Federals were twice repulsed. But supports came crowding up, and Evans sent back for reinforcements. The fight had lasted for an hour. It was near 11 o'clock, and the check to the enemy's advance had given time for the Confederates to form a line of battle on the Henry Hill. Bee and Bartow, accompanied by Imboden's battery, were in position. Hampton's Legion, a regiment raised and commanded by an officer who was one of the wealthiest planters in South Carolina and who became one of the finest soldiers in the Confederacy, was not far behind, and Jackson was coming up. Again the situation was saved by the prompt initiative of a brigade commander. Bee had been ordered to support the troops at the Stone Bridge. Moving forward towards the Henry Hill, he had been informed by a mounted orderly that the whole Federal army seemed to be moving to the northwest. A signal officer on the plateau who had caught the glint of the brass field pieces which accompanied the hostile column, still several miles distant, had sent the message. Bee waited for no further instructions. Ordering Bartow to follow, he climbed the Henry Hill. The wide and beautiful landscape lay spread before him. Evans's small command was nearly a mile distant on the Matthews Hill, and on the ridges to the far northwest he saw the glitter of many bayonets. 11 a.m. Rapidly placing his battery in position near the Henry House, Bee formed a line of battle on the crest above Young's Branch. But very shortly afterwards, acceding to an appeal for help from Evans, he hurried his troops forward to the Matthews Hill. His new position protected the rear of the companies which held the Stone Bridge, and so long as the bridge was held, the two wings of the Federal army were unable to cooperate. But on the Matthews Hill, the enemy's strength, especially in artillery, was overwhelming, and the Confederates were soon compelled to fall back to the Henry Hill. McDowell had already sent word to Tyler to force the Stone Bridge, and Sherman's brigade of this division, passing the stream by a ford, threatened the flank of Bee and Evans as they retreated across Young's Branch. The Federals now swarmed over the Matthews Hill, but Imboden's battery, which Bee had again posted on the Henry Hill, and Hampton's Legion occupying the Robinson House, a wooden tenement on the open spur which projects towards the Stone Bridge, covered the retirement of the discomfited brigades. They were not, however, suffered to fall back unharassed. A long line of guns, following fast upon their tracks and crossing the fields at a gallop, came into action on the opposite slope. In vain Imboden's gunners, with their pieces well placed behind a swell of ground, strove to divert their attention from the retreating infantry, now climbing the slopes of the Henry Hill. The Federal batteries, powerful in numbers, in discipline, and in material, plied their fire fast. The shells fell in quick succession amongst the disordered ranks of the Southern regiments, and not all the efforts of their officers could stay their flight. The day seemed lost. Strong masses of Northern infantry were moving forward past the stone house on the Warrenton Turnpike. Hampton's Legion was retiring on the right. Imboden's battery, with but 3 rounds remaining for each piece, galloped back across the Henry Hill, and this commanding height, the key of the battleground, was abandoned to the enemy. But help was at hand. Jackson, like Bee and Bartow, had been ordered to the Stone Bridge. Hearing the heavy fire to his left increasing in intensity, he had turned the head of his column towards the most pressing danger, and had sent a messenger to Bee to announce his coming. As he pushed rapidly forward, part of the troops he intended to support swept by in disorder to the rear. Imboden's battery came dashing back, and that officer, meeting Jackson, expressed with a profanity which was evidently displeasing to the general his disgust at being left without support. "I'll support your battery," was the brief reply. "Unlimber right here." 11:30 a.m. At this moment appeared General B, approaching at full gallop, and he and Jackson met face to face. The latter was cool and composed. B covered with dust and sweat, his sword in his hand and his horse foaming. "General," he said, "they are beating us back." "Then, sir, we will give them the bayonet." The thin lips closed like a vice, and the 1st Brigade, pressing up the slope, formed into line on the eastern edge of the Henry Hill. Jackson's determined bearing inspired B with renewed confidence. He turned bridle and galloped back to the ravine where his officers were attempting to reform their broken companies. Riding into the midst of the throng, he pointed with his sword to the Virginia regiments, deployed in well-ordered array on the height above. "Look!" he shouted. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The men took up the cry, and the happy augury of the expression, applied at a time when defeat seemed imminent and hearts were failing, was remembered when the danger had passed away. The position which Jackson had occupied was the strongest that could be found. He had not gone forward to the crest which looks down upon Young's Branch and commands the slopes by which the Federals were advancing. From that crest extended a wide view and a wide field of fire, but both flanks would have been exposed. The Henry House was nothing more than a cottage. Neither here nor elsewhere was there shelter for his riflemen, and they would have been exposed to the full force of the Federal artillery without power of reply. But on the eastern edge of the hill, where he had chosen to deploy, ran a belt of young pines, affording excellent cover, which merged into a dense oak wood near the Sudley Road. Along the edge of the pines, Jackson placed his regiments, with 6 guns to support them. Lying in rear of the guns were the 4th and 27th Virginia. On the right was the 5th, on the left the 2nd and 33rd. Both flanks were in the woods, and Stuart, whom Jackson had called upon to secure his left, was watching the ground beyond the road. To the front, for a space of 500 yards, stretched the level crest of the hill, and the ground beyond the Henry House, dipping to the valley of Young's Branch, where the Federals were now gathering, was wholly unseen. But as the tactics of Wellington so often proved, a position from which the view is limited, well in rear of a crest line, may be exceedingly strong for defence, provided that troops who hold it can use the bayonet. It would be difficult in the extreme for the Federals to pave the way for their attack with artillery. From the guns on the Matthews Hill, the Virginia regiments were well sheltered, and the range was long. To do effective work, the hostile batteries would have to cross Young's Branch, ascend the Henry Hill, and come into action within 500 yards of Jackson's line. Even if they were able to hold their ground at so short a range, they could make no accurate practice under the fire of the Confederate marksmen. 12 noon. In rear of Jackson's line, B, Bartow, and Evans were rallying their men when Johnston and Beauregard, compelled by the unexpected movement of the Federals to abandon all idea of attack, appeared upon the Henry Hill. They were accompanied by 2 batteries of artillery, Pendleton's and Albertis. The colours of the broken regiments were ordered to the front, and the men rallied, taking post on Jackson's right. The moment was critical. The blue masses of the Federals, the dust rolling high above them, were already descending the opposite slopes. The guns flashed fiercely through the yellow cloud, and the Confederate force was but a handful. 3 brigades had been summoned from the fords, but the nearest was 4 miles distant, and many of the troops upon the plateau were already half demoralized by retreat. The generals set themselves to revive the courage of their soldiers. Beauregard galloped along the line, cheering the regiments in every portion of the field, and then, with the colour-bearers accompanying him, rode forward to the crest. Johnston was equally conspicuous. The enemy's shells were bursting on every side, and the shouts of the Confederates, recognizing their leaders as they dashed across the front, redoubled the uproar. Meanwhile, before the centre of his line, with an unconcern which had a marvellous effect on his untried command, Jackson rode slowly to and fro. Except that his face was a little paler and his eyes brighter, he looked exactly as his men had seen him so often on parade. And as he passed along the crest above them, they heard from time to time the reassuring words, uttered in a tone which betrayed no trace of excitement, "Steady, men! Steady! All's well!" It was at this juncture, while the confusion of taking up a new position with shattered and ill-drilled troops was at the highest, that the battle lulled. The Federal infantry, after defeating Bee and Evans, had to cross the deep gully and marshy banks of Young's Branch to climb the slope of the Henry Hill and to form for a fresh attack. Even with trained soldiers, a hot fight is so conducive of disorder that it is difficult to initiate a rapid pursuit, and the northern regiments were very slow in resuming their formations. At the same time, too, the fire of their batteries became less heavy. From their position beyond Young's Branch, the rifled guns had been able to ply the Confederate lines with shell, and their effective practice had rendered the work of rallying the troops exceedingly difficult. But when his infantry advanced, McDowell ordered one half of his artillery, 2 fine batteries of regulars, made up principally of rifled guns, to cross Young's Branch. This respite was of the utmost value to the Confederates. The men, encouraged by the gallant bearing of their leaders, fell in at once upon the colours, and when Hunter's regiments appeared on the further rim of the plateau, they were received with a fire which for a moment drove them back. But the regular batteries were close at hand, and as they came into action, the battle became general on the Henry Hill. The Federals had 16,000 infantry available, the Confederates no more than 6,500. But the latter were superior in artillery, 16 pieces confronting 12. The Federal guns, however, were of heavier calibre. The gunners were old soldiers, and both friend and foe testify to the accuracy of their fire, their fine discipline, and staunch endurance. The infantry, on the other hand, was not well handled. The attack was purely frontal. No attempt whatever was made to turn the Confederate flanks, although the stone bridge, except for the abatis, was now open, and Johnston's line might easily have been taken in reverse. Nor does it appear that the cavalry was employed to ascertain where the flanks rested. Moreover, instead of massing the troops for a determined onslaught, driven home by sheer weight of numbers, the attack was made by successive brigades, those in rear waiting till those in front had been defeated, and, in the same manner, the brigades attacked by successive regiments. Such tactics were inexcusable. It was certainly necessary to push the attack home before the Confederate reinforcements could get up, and troops who had never drilled in mass would have taken much time to assume the orthodox formation of several lines of battle, closely supporting one another. Yet there was no valid reason, beyond the inexperience of the generals in dealing with large bodies, that brigades should have been sent into action piecemeal, or that the flanks of the defence should have been neglected. The fighting, nevertheless, was fierce. The Federal regiments, inspirited by their success on the Matthews Hill, advanced with confidence, and soon pushed forward past the Henry House. "The contest that ensued," says General Imboden, "was terrific. Jackson ordered me to go from battery to battery and see that the guns were properly aimed and the fuses cut the right length. This was the work of but a few minutes. On returning to the left of the line of guns, I stopped to ask General Jackson's permission to rejoin my battery. The fight was just then hot enough to make him feel well. His eyes fairly blazed. He had a way of throwing up his left hand with the open palm towards the person he was addressing, and, as he told me to go, he made this gesture. The air was full of flying missiles, and as he spoke he jerked down his hand, and I saw that blood was streaming from it. I exclaimed, "General, you are wounded." "Only a scratch, a mere scratch," he replied, and binding it hastily with a handkerchief, he galloped away along his line. 1:30 p.m. When the battle was at its height, and across that narrow space, not more than 500 yards in width, the cannon thundered, and the long lines of infantry struggled for the mastery. The 2 Federal batteries, protected by 2 regiments of infantry on their right, advanced to a more effective position. The movement was fatal. Stuart, still guarding the Confederate left, was eagerly awaiting his opportunity, and now, with 150 troopers filing through the fences on Bald Hill, he boldly charged the enemy's right. The regiment thus assailed, a body of Zouaves in blue and scarlet with white turbans, was ridden down, and almost at the same moment the 33rd Virginia, posted on Jackson's left, charged forward from the copse in which they had been hidden. The uniforms in the two armies at this time were much alike, and from the direction of their approach it was difficult at first for the officers in charge of the Federal batteries to make sure that the advancing troops were not their own. A moment more, and the doubtful regiment proved its identity by a deadly volley, delivered at a range of 70 yards. Every gunner was shot down, the teams were almost annihilated, and several officers fell killed or wounded. The Zouaves, already much shaken by Stuart's well-timed charge, fled down the slopes, dragging with them another regiment of infantry. 3 guns alone escaped the marksmen of the 33rd. The remainder stood upon the field, silent and abandoned, surrounded by dying horses, midway between the opposing lines. This success, however, brought but short relief to the Confederates. The enemy was not yet done with. Fresh regiments passed to the attack. The 33rd was driven back, and the thin line upon the plateau was hard put to it to retain its ground. The Southerners had lost heavily. Bee and Bartow had been killed and Hampton wounded. Few reinforcements had reached the Henry Hill. Stragglers and skulkers were streaming to the rear. The Federals were thronging forward, and it seemed that the exhausted defenders must inevitably give way before the successive blows of superior numbers. The troops were losing confidence, yet no thought of defeat crossed Jackson's mind. "General," said an officer, riding hastily towards him, "the day is going against us." "If you think so, sir," was the quiet reply, "you had better not say anything about it." And although affairs seemed desperate, in reality the crisis of the battle had already passed. McDowell had but 2 brigades remaining in reserve, and one of these, of Tyler's division, was still beyond Bull Run. His troops were thoroughly exhausted. They had been marching and fighting since midnight. The day was intensely hot. They had encountered fierce resistance. Their rifled batteries had been silenced, and the Confederate reinforcements were coming up. 2 of Bonham's regiments had taken post on Jackson's right, and a heavy force was approaching on the left. Kirby Smith's brigade of the Army of the Shenandoah, coming up by train, had reached Manassas Junction while the battle was in progress. It was immediately ordered to the field, and had been already instructed by Johnston to turn the enemy's right. But before the weight of Smith's 1900 bayonets could be thrown into the scale, the Federals made a vigorous effort to carry the Henry Hill. Those portions of the Confederate line which stood on the open ground gave way before them. Some of the guns, ordered to take up a position from which they could cover the retreat, were limbering up, and with the exception of the belt of pines, the plateau was abandoned to the hostile infantry, who were beginning to press forward at every point. The Federal engineers were already clearing away the abatis from the stone bridge in order to give passage to Tyler's 3rd Brigade and a battery of artillery. And all were certain, says McDowell, that the day was ours. 2:45 p.m. Jackson's men were lying beneath the crest of the plateau. Only one of his regiments, the 33rd, had as yet been engaged in the open, and his guns in front still held their own. Riding to the centre of his line, where the 2nd and 4th Virginia were stationed, he gave orders for a counterstroke. "Reserve your fire till they come within 50 yards, then fire and give them the bayonet, and when you charge, yell like furies." Right well did the hot Virginian blood respond. Inactive from the stroke of noon till 3 o'clock, with the crash and cries of battle in their ears, and the shells ploughing gaps in their recumbent ranks, the men were chafing under the stern discipline which held them back from the conflict they longed to join. The Federals swept on, extending from the right and left, cheering as they came, and following the flying batteries in the ardour of success. Suddenly, a long grey line sprang from the ground in their very faces. A rolling volley threw them back in confusion, and then, with their fierce shouts pealing high above the tumult, the 2nd and 4th Virginia, supported by the 5th, charged forward across the hill. At the same moment that the enemy's centre was thus unexpectedly assailed, Kirby Smith's fresh brigade bore down upon the flank, and Beauregard, with ready judgment, dispatched his staff officers to order a general advance.